The following discussion is for religious and educational purposes only. Nothing you hear on this podcast is medical advice or an encouragement to use any substance outside a lawful religious or medical setting. And with that out of the way, let's take it to the Hearthcast. Welcome back to the Hearthcast, where science meets the sacred. We're your hosts. I'm Kelsey.
And this is Jessa. Today we're talking about grief. Not the cleaned up version that people like to post about on social media, but the real thing that hits your body, rearranges your emotional landscape, and refuses to follow a schedule.
And we want to talk about it honestly because for most of us, grief feels like something that we're supposed to manage in private. Even though it's one of the most universal human experiences, it's treated like a personal failure when it shows up. I know I've been walking my grief path for a couple of years now with the death of my ex-partner, who I loved very much. And now I'm about 2 weeks out from a pretty fresh breakup with the person that I loved after him. So this is not an abstract topic for me, and it's something that I'm actively navigating. And I thought maybe you would want to navigate it with me.
And that's one of the things we've both seen in our own lives and in our community is how entheogens interact with grief.
Yeah. That's a whole story for sure. I've been reading a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow recently, and it's about the sacred work of grief and reframes grief as something that is communal and sacred and necessary, where I think it's very easy in our culture to sort of feel ashamed of your own grief. It's a very isolating experience. And this book has been really helpful for that. I think that it's something that I'd love to share and talk about with you.
I think it is a sacred work and something that we need to do on multiple levels. And when we physically injure ourselves, there's an understanding like, oh, it takes time. Maybe you've got deep tissue therapy, or there's an understanding that it's a working process. But with grief, it's almost like there's a get over it. It's not so bad.
Yeah, and even when it's not, it's this idea that we have a very individualized culture, right? But we used to belong to a village. We used to have more of a communal relationship with grief. But in our culture, grief is really privatized. You're supposed to go to therapy. You cry alone in your car. How many of us have sat there in our cars just crying, and then we wipe our tears and we suck it up and we go into the next thing where we're going to be around people, right? And this is, I think, one of the things that can be really, really hard when it's carried so privately. It can harden and it can pull us below the surface, and we can feel like we're drowning because nobody wants grief. I know that for me, I didn't ask for it, and it felt like such a heavy burden that I didn't want to ask other people to carry it either. And really, could they even carry it with me? It's more like walking alongside someone who's carrying it than carrying it yourself if you're not the one feeling it.
And we've discussed that when you're working with psychedelics, it's not a magic bullet. It doesn't magically go away. And a lot of times it can enhance what you're feeling. And if you're not ready to face it, if you're not in the place to do that work, it can be harmful, especially if you're doing it without support.
Yeah. So I have a story about this that is, okay, so I lost my partner, my ex-partner. I lost him a couple years ago, and I was really in love with him at the time, but he was struggling with substance use disorder. And so we weren't in touch when he did pass away. But it was overwhelming when I found out because it was the end. There was no more reconciliation. There would be no more possibility of repair. It was done. And I wanted the pain to be over. It was the most overwhelming experience that I've ever gone through. I just cried in my bed for days and always in the car and just barely made it through. And I wanted to, for lack of a better word, I didn't want to be here anymore, right? Like I wanted to join him. And I think that level of pain scares a lot of people because they don't know, they're not professionals. They don't know what to do with it. And it's not that I wanted to die specifically. I just didn't want to be here anymore without him. I couldn't imagine it. And I think that I was talking to a friend about this who works with ibogaine, and really what I was talking about was I was interested in an ibogaine journey, and the reason why he was asking me a lot of questions about what my goals were, all the intention setting that we recommend people do, right? And we were having that initial conversation, and I'd heard people talk about taking ibogaine and seeing loved ones who had died. And I thought, like, I want that. I want to see him. I do not want to sit in this world and have this empty life without him.
Mm-hmm.
And when I said that to a friend who was working with it, he said, this is not going to be good for you right now. This is you trying not to face the fact that he is gone and he's not coming back.
Mm-hmm.
Even like now, it's hard for me to say that, right? Like, if you go in and you don't see him, if you go take ibogaine and you don't see him, well, then now we have to deal with the grief when you come back without him, because you have not accepted that he's gone. And that really landed with me. It was the moment that I realized that grief, what it really is, it's asking you to cross a gate that you don't want to cross.
Yeah. Grief is love with nowhere to go.
Yeah. It's the gate where you accept that something sucks. Like, you are not in control. You're not going to get what you wanted. You can kick and scream and fight and deny it, but it's true. It's not coming back. And so for me, in that moment, like, my desire to engage with ibogaine, it wasn't about healing. It was about not wanting to face the finality of the loss.
Mm-hmm.
And that I just so appreciated him saying that to me, because he was right, and it could have been delivered in a very different way, but because it was delivered with so much love,
Mm-hmm.
it was somebody who saw my grief and held it and was like, I understand why you're feeling this way, but it's not going to bring him back. And so I actually haven't engaged in entheogens in a while, because I'm still working through just like that acceptance, and just grief in general is something that is hard to face and hard to deal with. I haven't been wanting to bypass any of that. But I know other people deal with grief and feel that entheogens are very helpful. And I think, Jessa, you have some stories about that might elucidate the situations where it could be helpful, or that it does help navigate grief.
Right. So for me, the clearest experience of when I just rushed headlong into grief was when my daughter decided to move out for the first time. When she moved out, I just found myself alone in the place we had shared, and I was immediately hit with a wall of, who am I now? Because it hasn't been an easy journey. We've had our ups and downs, and there's some stuff that we've navigated that are probably far too common. I don't want to say it's a unique scenario. I'll own it. Like, it's the reality of life right now. And when being somebody's mother and fighting for them and loving them and navigating broken systems for them becomes your identity for over half your life, who are you when that person no longer needs that kind of care? And especially when so many other aspects of my identity and who I was wrapped up in it, then when that's gone, I think that's something that is common and maybe less talked about in an empty nest situation. Is like, when your kids are no longer with you and you've been a parent, then what? And so that was the first time I had done a seriously heroic dose of mushrooms. I had been well experienced. I had checked in with people. It was advised that, okay, you're ready to face it. This is time. And to say that it was cathartic is an understatement. For some of it, I was dancing. For some of it, I was crying. I was revisiting things, replaying things, connecting to myself, and having a long conversation with the sacrament and with who I am, and with what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Because when you're so focused on survival, and so much of it is, how do I pay the bills this month? What am I going to do for a job? How do I navigate the healthcare system? When you're no longer caught up in the immediate need, that was such a shift. And that was a point of where I was ready to walk through that gate or walk through that door. And at the end of it, I was exhausted. and I slept very well. But what was fascinating was I didn't need to drink. I didn't
Hmm.
need cannabis to go to sleep. It was like a complete rewiring had happened of my brain. And that really showed me how sometimes trauma or grief puts us into loops in our brain, almost like a well-worn ruts in the road.
Mm.
And with kind of the neurogenesis or being able to shift my perspective and create new connections, it got me out of the ruts. So I wasn't going down the same thought loops over and over again, but I was able to look at the situation through a new light, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like really that journey, while grief was part of it, you had kind of faced that already. And now it was the embracing of your own identity and figuring that out. And that was part of that journey more so. Whereas with mine, I was very much outrunning uh, the loss itself.
I don't know. I think it was probably more immediate, and maybe it's just because this is a couple years down the road. It
Sure.
seems as I'm telling it because it more felt like a wall and almost like I felt myself going to a very dark place and almost like
Mm.
the walls closing in because when you bury pain, when you don't face things, when you're in a survival mode for that long, it's almost like when you're always working, you finally take a break and you get sick. Because it's like all that backlog of what you haven't
Yeah.
been taking care of yourself. It felt emotionally like that, like this wall of undealt with emotions were just rushing at me. And I started to slip into a dark place that I've worked to avoid or tried to get away from. And that was because it's like, it for me almost felt like emergency. Like if I don't do this now, I'm worried about where I'll go.
So how does somebody then navigate? I mean, it seems to me like maybe the thread here is avoidance. If you're
Hmm.
avoiding, if you need to kind of like look internally at yourself and say, am I engaging with sacrament to avoid
Hmm.
something I don't want to look at, or am I not engaging with sacrament and avoiding things by not engaging? And so it's really
Right.
that question of avoidance, like, and really getting true and honest with yourself before engaging on a grief journey. Because to like, I could see situations that we've just elucidated, two situations where we both took very different paths,
Hmm.
but the consistency that I'm seeing is maybe that avoidance piece, um, being
Yeah.
the guiding light, not wanting to avoid.
Yeah. For me, it was running addicts. It's like I have to deal with this now or I don't like where this could go. But that's also part of like when I'm coaching people and they come to me with something they're dealing with, I help them check in with themselves and to learn to trust because I think ultimately deep down, people know what they need. They know when they're avoiding. And what I try to do in my coaching is to help people connect with what they actually need and where they're at and maybe do some nudges and ask some questions but ultimately have the decision to be theirs because it's their journey that they're on. And I really like what your friend said to you, and I felt that was a kindness, and that's something similar to what I've said to other folks when they've come to me saying, "Oh, I just want to deal with this thing." I'm like, are you sure you're ready?"
Hmm.
Like, and I think you're right on the avoidance thing.
Yeah, I think we have a culture of avoidance. I mean, this is one of the things that I really struggle with in my life in general is I I'm not an avoidant person for the most part. Obviously, like I think we have a culture that celebrates stoicism and celebrates individualism and also encourages avoidance
Hmm.
because of the celebration of stoicism. I know, like growing up, I was very sensitive as a child. I was a really emotional kid, and I definitely internalized the lesson that you're too sensitive, and you need to be stronger, right? And I think that that is even more pronounced in men. I mean,
Hmm.
I know so many beautiful, sensitive men that hate their own sensitivity.
Or they're ashamed of it, or they hide it,
Oh
or
my
see it
gosh.
as, like they start crying because they feel comfortable with me, and then they're mortified. Like that is the worst possible thing that could ever happen, is anyone see their
Oh,
vulnerability.
and that hurts so much because for me, as somebody who grew up being told I was too sensitive, when I
Hmm.
see people that also grew up being considered too sensitive, like I see somebody who I can connect with, I'm like, oh, we have this in common. We are not broken. We live in a society that doesn't understand or appreciate us, but this is like we can find each other. We can support each other, but so often the and mostly like this is an issue in my romantic relationships where like the men that I have loved as an adult have been really sensitive and I love that about them, but they hate it about themselves.
Mm.
And so I've watched the way that the culture grinds them down and they hate something about themselves that I adore. And it makes it hard to connect because they are oftentimes trying to like shut that part down of themselves. They're trying to
Right.
avoid that part of themselves, whereas I'm like trying to crack it open and get in there. And it's hard. It's sad.
Well, and that's the thing, is healthy masculinity is strength in tenderness,
Yeah.
and
That's,
having that become a thing and give men in our lives permission, or people permission to feel like that masculine part of themselves, that it's like it's also tender. It fights to protect because they care. It's still nurturing. It's not just the realm of women, and I feel like that's so much of the issue that we're seeing in our society is, women are complaining about having to always do the emotional labor and work because we've built a culture in society that does not allow men to feel,
yeah.
or
And it's,
punishes them for it.
and it's heartbreaking, right? I mean, watching somebody that you love exile their own heart in real
Hmm.
time and there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, it's because there isn't. You can't do this work for somebody else. You can't love them through it. You can't love someone for themselves. Like they are the ones that ultimately have to do this. And I don't like that. I wish I could do it for them. um, I absolutely would if I could. It's uh, it's been it's been painful because I think that that ties in. I mean, that ties in with the so Francis Weller, this book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. Part of the reason why I think it's so good is it walks through the different gates of grief, and so it can give words to grief that I think are sometimes hard to come by.
Hmm.
And one of them is obvious. It's basically like we're going to lose everybody that we love. That's a gate of grief.
Right.
That's the one we all are pretty accustomed with, and I think have words to describe. But then there's this one, which is like the places that have not known love.
Mm.
And that's where the shame piece comes in. And how do we confront that? And that's one of the places that I think entheogens can be incredibly helpful for, is to
Absolutely.
infuse love into those spots of shame and to really allow yourself to confront those spaces. And then um, and then grieve too. Like this is one of the gates is what we expected and did not receive. So love for those places. I
Hmm.
think that for me, as a sensitive child, I grew up in a culture that didn't value a
Right.
key part of my identity. And that is something that I internalized as like, I am broken. But I don't think that's the case. I actually, as an adult and having done this work, I think that sensitivity is a beautiful thing. And it just didn't have the right container for me growing up to understand that. And so I'm trying to create this community that I wish I had
Right.
of what I and there, but there's been grief in that. There's been grief in I needed this and I didn't get it as a child.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think, I mean, if we're to talk about the different types of grief that we're feeling, um, I think there's grief at the increased disconnection from one another, from this planet that sustains us, from culture, from identity. There's grief. Think about how prevalent sexual assault and all those other traumas are. It's 1 in 3 women, 1 in 2 women, 1 in 6 men have, experienced violation of who they are. And so much of culture, like even the churches are places we're supposed to be safe, for the ones that shame you for being a victim.
Mm-hmm.
There's war, there's displacement, there's the trauma of seeing what's happening ecologically.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the next gate that Weller talks about, which is the sorrows of the world. This
Hmm.
one is really hard. And I'm sure a lot of us can identify with this, like turning on the news and there's just so much pain. I mean,
Hmm.
it it's hard. You're like, what do I do? Do I numb myself? I have to numb myself. I need to put in, therapy. I've been to therapy and talked about this, and a lot of therapists don't know how to talk about this
Yeah.
because it's legitimate. I mean, you're basically told, oh, you need to put in more emotional boundaries and just like ignore it. And I think there's just certainly a place for healthy compartmentalization. You cannot bathe in this kind of thing. But what we are missing, I think, in our culture is a space for communal grief around this. Where does that cosmic sadness that we all carry get turned into action versus just grief that is everywhere but inexplainable and just impossible to hold and just barfed all over the world but not explained or cared about. I don't know. It's a challenge that we have in our society. I think so many people feel ecological grief and sadness and sorrows for the world, but have no idea how to even approach it.
That or they become addicted to dealing with it. I was having a conversation with someone who, because of their career, are around a lot of Hollywood types that have their shamans or healers down in LA, and it's become an industry. And
Mm.
so, there's, these groups of people who get to experience these private sessions, but nothing changes. They're just always continually working on themselves and cycling in the grief, and that itself becomes a performance, and then you don't actually ever have to deal with it because you're always processing it.
Yeah, that's a form of spiritual bypassing, right? Like
Mhm.
you're always on a healing journey. You just need to heal. If you just heal a little bit more, I think part of this is just how do you sit with it? How do you accept that this is part of the world?
Right.
And this is what I mean by like part of grief is facing the things that you really don't want to face. Like I don't want to accept that this is the reality. You
Hmm.
have to. You have to accept that this pain exists. There is mass starvation and war and genocide and mining and ecological collapse right now and sexual violence and all these things exist and you can spend all your time healing from it, but in some ways part of it is just accepting this and really like crying about it once in a
Yeah.
while.
And for me, what shifted was when I could find the beauty even in the grief,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because it was like, yes, it hurts, but I loved that deeply. I experienced something that moved me to that dimension, or the beauty in how many people care and are throwing themselves into doing the work against something that seems insurmountable, like when they should just give up.
Right.
They're fighting to make sure homeless people are fed, or working to end war, or trying to do what they can to mitigate the impacts of what we're seeing with climate change. And
Yeah, I think that it's really easy to collapse into nihilism. I think that a lot of people do. But I think nihilism itself is just its own form of avoidance because
Mhm.
it's easy to say, oh, well, nothing matters, so I just give up. But then I think you do neglect the fact that there is this deep well of grief that's there for the sorrows of the world. I think I try to remind myself that I would never feel this sorrow if there wasn't so much beauty.
Right.
I think that's been that's been the comfort for me through a lot of this like grief and being a sensitive person. I feel things really deeply and I
Mhm.
think that it can be a huge challenge to feel things deeply, to feel shame about feeling things deeply. Um, but then also to accept that I get to feel things deeply. I get to feel joy deeply. I get to really find awe and wonder in the tiniest things, like I love how fat bumblebees are. They are so fat, they're so chubby and they're so cute. And I don't know if other people feel the joy that I feel about bumblebees, but it's there. And or like how grabby the little hands of raccoons are. Like it just gives me so much joy. And I think that understanding that darkness is, you can't have light without darkness.
Right.
That makes the darkness easier to navigate, or at
Hmm.
least easier to accept. Whereas if you avoid it entirely, I think you give up so much of that light because you can't selectively numb yourself. Like, it's
Right.
just impossible. One thing you were saying, Jessa, that I'd love to touch on again, because I think it also goes back to grief processing, is that you were talking about other people being an inspiration for you
Hmm.
and how they deal with grief and how they're helping or trying to make things better. And I think that goes back to kind of the idea of community and the importance
Hmm.
of community in grief, because we have a very individualistic culture.
Right.
And I felt this pressure to really have my grief be private, go to therapy, keep it all contained, go to work, be professional, compartmentalize, cry in the car, get home, cry in bed. But all that to say, I actually think that there needs to be a witness to grief to
Right.
really move through it. And so I guess I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about just the importance of community. I don't know what
I've got a
that,
couple. Yeah.
yeah.
So a lot of, funny enough, a good portion of my grief work started at Standing Rock. That was only really the second time I'd been in a place where I was not a part of the culture that was dominant in that space. I was grateful to be brought into ceremony, and so much of my efforts to reconnect to my own ancestry, my own cultural practices, to do this work, to really dive into the healing work, came from what I saw there. Because when you lose identity, when you're not connected to place, it's really easy to latch on to the first thing you see that looks like what you've been missing. And I think that's part of why we see in colonialism appropriation being such a common thing, is because it's like, oh, I don't really know who I am or where I'm from. That just really helped me understand where the heart of that comes from. But it was also the fierce joy I saw in grief. These are people I've seen come, deal with the boarding school reality and the loss of land, and seeing places that are sacred to them continually threatened. But there was still dancing, there was still songs, there was still jokes. So as much as they were serious about protecting the water and standing up for their rights and for the generations yet to come, native and not, it was really feeling the power of that community and realizing that those are spaces we don't really have in our culture right now in
Yeah.
America. The spot where those things can mix and come together, like there's a few, but I feel like that's something that BIPOC or queer communities or other folks who have been continually oppressed, it's like with Pride, like the first Pride was a riot,
Mm-hmm.
but it's now it's celebration and joy. But it's that similar thing of like holding that grief, holding that loss and the pain, but doing so in a way that shows the resilience of the human spirit. And those are spaces that
Yeah.
have definitely influenced my work.
We need to be able to create these spaces for anyone where they can arrive, where they can drop into their sorrow and feel safe and be seen, and make a ritual of it where you can acknowledge that your grief is here. We don't have to
Hmm.
solve your grief here. This is something sacred. It belongs at the center of the fire. It
Hmm.
belongs here. You are not broken. You are just navigating things the best you can.
Right.
And I think that that's maybe where we can start to connect all of these grief centers, where we all have different paths. Some of us have more privilege in life. And at the same time, what you just said, we all have this grief center. And that I think can maybe help us start at a place, because this is going to take so much time,
Right. Generations of work.
generations of work.
But but at some point you have to break the cycle, and that feeds into like some of the conversations I'm having is around helping heal sexual assault survivors from war and POWs, like coming out of what's happening in Ukraine right now. And if we can figure out the protocols for that, extending that to other war zones. But it's like, if we don't intercede and break that trauma loop, like epigenetics show that their kids are going to carry that, even if those kids did not experience the war.
Mm-hmm.
They did in their genetics. Nature and nurture, like it's in them. And it's so much more common for someone to become a victim or even a perpetrator of harm when they've experienced it, or when it's something that's a part of their own ancestral baggage. That having those intercession points and working with it as directly as we can to stop that from being pushed to the next generation of folks is how we start to shift things.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't opt out of grief if you're going to love anything in this world, right?
Right.
You can opt out of facing it, but then it runs your life from the underground and it passes on to your children and your communities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So much there.
And so, I think that really supporting this grief work in community is the way forward. It's hard, right? Like how do we do it? We have a few ideas. But I mean, you can start with tiny practices in your own life. Like even if you're not part of, the Entheo Church community, you can do tiny practices where you let one trusted person really see your grief. I know that I had a friend, I lost some friends over the grief that I had. People just felt like it was too much. They didn't know how to hold it. And that was an added layer of grief on top of it. I lost one of my best friends that way. But you know what? Other people showed up for me. One of my friends, who's also one of my closest friends, she was incredible. She just allowed me to exist next to her, and I didn't have to hide my grief. She was just like, "You're good here. You can cry. You can be miserable. I'm still here, and that's okay." Those people, like, let somebody take the vulnerable step of just letting someone see your grief. That's a huge one.
Yeah. To add to that, I think maybe also approaching how to engage with entheogens to help yourself through this. If someone's not ready for a bigger journey, or maybe if they don't know if they are, I like to suggest people start with microdoses. It's almost a way of like introducing your body gradually to it, because like as you've said, like with psilocybin, like stuff still comes up and you're still dealing with it, but maybe it's not the deep ego death face everything, but more of a gentle, let's explore the container and engage with it intentionally, journal, work through it, take breaks. And then when you're ready to go into something deeper, then work with someone and have there be active preparation. So the first phase of ceremony is all the pre-work, all the preparation you do leading up to it, and having someone to support you in that space. Because if this is an intense grief thing, for most people, it is better to have that external person that can hold that space or just sit with you. They don't necessarily need to do anything, but they're just there. And I think if it's someone we trust, that helps us let our guard down a little bit and be able to engage and get into that space. So I think it's more of an intentional engagement, sensitive to when you feel ready, not bypassing, but leaning in and having it be something that is a process of walking through something, instead of staying and engaging in a continual loop of practice.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and you can incorporate grounding as well, because I know that one of the things, like, it can just feel so overwhelming. I mean, it depends on whether it's acute grief or whether, there's achy long lasting grief that you're just like, I don't even know how to deal with. I think that's when microdosing can be incredibly helpful,
Mhm.
because sometimes it's like you've been avoiding it for a long time. Now you're ready to face it, but it's a little bit on the achier side as opposed to the just overwhelming, I can't even function grief. And I would say there's, simple rituals in nature that you can do that are grounding. I used to love to walk barefoot.
Mhm.
For me, that was really helpful.
For me, it's walking into an ocean and just
Yeah.
feeling like, especially the Pacific, like in my hardest times,
Cold.
I know, but I grew up swimming in the Columbia River as a baby, like lived right on the banks
Yeah.
of it. So cold water feels like home, and kind of the shock of it
Hmm.
and how your body comes alive when you're in it and just feeling that connection. So whatever, finding and connecting with those places, those practices that are meaningful for you, connecting with kin, and maybe for some people, it is your pet, it is your animal companion. They are great at helping us walk through and hold grief. Especially when we're feeling lonely, maybe there's not other folks. Like there's real power there, and they are there for us too.
There's power in naming it too. I think that
Right.
especially if you're working with grief that's less obvious. I mean, it's grief can be pretty obvious if you're going through something that our dominant culture gives us language for, you know, death and loss of people. That's easier for us to metabolize, I think,
Right.
oftentimes, or at least there's language for it. But if you're going through this grief that is more so ancestral, or feeling like ripped from the land that your ancestors came from, or the sorrows of the world and ecological loss, spending some time really naming that gate of this is where this grief is coming from, even just naming it can be helpful.
Right.
uh, because without language it can kind of swirl around in this like malaise, but if you're at least naming it, you can pinpoint it, and you can start doing some sort of grief ritual and sharing it with people and being seen, because a lot of people feel these things, they just don't quite know how to
Right.
communicate it.
What's sadder is so many people are alone in their grief right now. So many
It
people are
makes me
just
so
sitting home.
sad. You're not
And
alone. I
I
promise.
know you're not. And it's so, to those who are listening today, if someone's been on your heart recently, just reach out to them and have lunch. Like, ultimately, like, yes, psychedelics can help. And it's something that, that Kelsey and I are both involved in. But really, at the end of the day, it's about connection to each other, to people. Feel better connected to your kin of all kinds, to this world that supports us, and one another. And when you feel better connected to those around you, you can feel a deeper connection to yourself. That just comes out of it.
Yeah, and you feel seen, like you're not defective for
Mm.
feeling this way. I think that so many of us feel like we should be doing better,
Mhm.
but you're not defective. Our culture fails to create the ritual container to say, I see your grief, I take your grief, and I release it. I think
Right.
that this ritualistic thing is something we need to develop over time. And if you can even just get a friend who also feels this way, develop your own ritual. There
Right.
are beautiful options that you can choose. I mean, this book has a few, and I think a lot of them are really beautiful. But yeah, I don't want you to feel alone. I think that I see you. I'm walking it right now.
Absolutely. Grief isn't going away. The question is not how do I get rid of this, but who can I walk with as I carry it? And if you do not have that container, consider this your invitation to build one, because other people need it too.
Yeah. If you're listening to this in your own wave of grief, I hope that you hear that you are not alone. You don't have to carry it alone. And I hope that you take the brave step of reaching out to someone who can help you carry it.
We're glad you joined us. To learn more, visit entheochurch.org. That's ENTHEO church.org.